Okay, so today we are picking up with Chapter 4, looking at federalism. Federalism and the division of power. Well, federalism, remember the last video we talked about, is a system of government where there's a division between a central government and several local governments. And this is spelled out in the 10th Amendment, because the 10th Amendment reserves powers for the state governments. So it's setting that aside. It's saying that there is going to be this division between the two. So first off, we're going to look at the national government. And the national government has a certain set of powers that it is able to do. These powers are called the delegated powers. And these are the powers that are granted to the national government by the Constitution. Now there's three types of delegated powers. You have the expressed powers, the implied powers, and the inherent powers. Now, expressed powers are those that are spelled out in the Constitution, that you can go to the Constitution and you can find that these are given to the national government. They are specifically given to the national government. And there are 27 of them. You don't have to know all of them, but you will on the test have to give me some examples. So, these express powers include things like being able to collect taxes, to coin money, to regulate trade, to maintain a military, and the power to declare war. Those are probably the easiest ones to remember. So those would be some examples of expressed powers that you can find in the Constitution. The second type are implied powers, and implied powers aren't directly found in the Constitution. They're not expressly stated like the expressed powers, but you can take meaning from it. So, for example, we have something called the elastic clause, or it's the necessary and proper clause, which helps us in carrying out the expressed powers, which is how we get the implied powers. For example, when you look at regulating trade, that's a power that's given to the national government, but it doesn't exactly say what they can do or how that power is to be applied or anything. And so this elastic clause, and it's called the elastic clause because it's like a rubber band, it can expand to include a lot of things for the expressed powers. And so, for example, with that regulating trade, we are able to build a highway system because that helps to regulate trade, because we're able to get trade from one state to another. We're able to move goods, so that's part of it. Whenever somebody moves stolen goods from across state lines, there's going to be legal ramifications for that. So that would be a part of regulating trade. Preventing racial discrimination when you're hiring, that is regulating trade because you're making sure that other things are being followed, as well as business practices and being having civil rights available to everybody. So those would all come under regulating trade. That one expressed power, those things would come under that, using the elastic clause where it's being stretched to encompass those things. The third type of delegated powers that are given to the national government are those powers called the inherent powers. And the inherent powers are those that have historically in the past belonged to government, whether that's European governments or the British government or any government. These are things that they typically, historically have had. So things like gaining territory, being able to add territory to your country. That's something the government is in charge of. Regulating immigration. Again, something that the government is typically in charge of. Deportation of aliens. That's another thing that the government historically has been in charge of. It's not something for state governments or for local governments to concern themselves with. It is a national delegated power. So, keeping with the national government, there are certain powers that are denied to the national government that they cannot do. For example, they cannot deny freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, all of those personal rights guaranteed like in the Bill of Rights. They can't do that. They can't set uniform marriage and divorce laws. That's a power reserved for the states, that they are able to do that. The national government can't say that you have to be 18 to get married, or you have to have a blood test to get married, or you have to get your license 6 months in advance, whatever it is. That's a state decision. They also cannot set a national public school system. That's another power reserved for the states, that education should be a local concern. not a national concern. Because people in Iowa are going to be educated and need a different kind of education than people in New York or people in California. That the different regions of our United States as it is what makes it essential for us to be able to educate our own people the way that we need them to be educated. And lastly, the Congress is not able to tax the states. It cannot tax the states. So then we have state governments. Okay, so we had the national government. Now let's look at the powers for the state government. And the state government has things called reserved powers. And these are powers that are held by the states. So these are powers that are not given to the national government, but they're also not denied to the states. So they're not specifically said you get these, but they come from the 10th Amendment. So things like marriage laws, a minimum age to buy alcohol, licensing for some professions like doctors and lawyers and teachers, because it differs from state to state. Going from my experience as a teacher, that here in Iowa, I get my Iowa license as a teacher, but if I were to move to Colorado or go to New York, I may not be able to teach because they would have different requirements. South Dakota, for example, requires you to know South Dakota history to become a teacher there. So I would have to take a class before I could get my license transferred. So that's a good example of how that works, that each state has their own requirements for what they want met. There are also powers that are denied to the states as well. For example, states cannot enter into treaties and alliances with foreign countries. That's a national government thing. They also cannot print or coin their own money. That is something the national government does. Then we have the exclusive powers. And the exclusive powers are those that are exercised only by the national government. And they include most of the delegated powers, but not all of them. So things that only the national government can do would be things like coining money. They can maintain armed forces. They can declare war. Those are things that only the national government can do. But then we have concurrent powers. And concurrent powers are things that both the states and the national governments can do. So things like collecting taxes, or defining crimes and punishments, or setting up court systems, establishing banks. Those would all be things that both the states and the national government can do. But if you notice, some of those powers are included in the delegated powers. So not all delegated powers are concurrent, and not all delegated powers are exclusive. So, where does all of this come from? Well, it comes from the supreme law of our land, which is our Constitution. How is this all allowed? A lot of it came from some Supreme Court cases that determined, okay, what is the role of the national government in the federal system? And one of the first cases that deals with this is the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. And this is going to be one of your case briefs for your after Bush versus Gore. This is the next one, McCulloch versus Maryland. So this one takes place in 1819, and it involves the second bank of the United States, which is a federal national bank, and it is going to be taxed by the Maryland government, a state government taxing the national bank. And the bank cashier, James McCulloch, is going to refuse to pay this tax, basically saying states shouldn't be allowed to tax national government. And the Supreme Court is going to be asked to review this case because the state court said that, yes, the bank needs to pay this tax. It's a business. It needs to pay this tax. And the Supreme Court is going to overturn that decision by saying that the states cannot tax the federal government, because if the states were allowed to do that, who is really in charge? Are the states in charge, or is the federal government supposed to be in charge? And if the states are able to tax and charge things on the national government, who's really the power? And it brought about that idea that, well, if the states are allowed to tax, then they're in power. And that's not the way our government was set up. Our government was set up where the national government has more power or is supposed to be superior in power to the states. It should not be taxing that way. So that has been a major court decision that helps to determine those things. Next, we're going to look at interstate relations. How do our states work together with each other? And they work together in several different ways. First off, through interstate compacts. And interstate compacts are agreements between the states to work together. They share like law enforcement data. They share motor vehicle safety registration. Everybody agrees that driver's license in one state will work in all the rest of the states, so that's kind of nice because if you go for a road trip or something, you don't have to bring along 10 or 11 different licenses to drive in different states, so that's good. They also work on conservation of resources. Like here in Iowa, we're very concerned about our waterways because we have rivers on both sides. So we have interstate compacts with our neighbors to our west and our neighbors to our east in terms of pollution and road construction and all that kind of stuff. Another way that states work together is through the full faith and credit clause. And this is part of the Constitution. And the full faith and credit clause says that states are going to respect the validity or the truth of other states' laws and regulations. And that means that a birth certificate in Iowa will be recognized as a birth certificate when you move to Oklahoma or you move to Oregon or whatever. Marriage licenses will be recognized. Titles to property, driver's licenses, all of these things are going to be recognized as legal documents because they were issued by the states themselves. Now, what makes this kind of interesting is that when Iowa became the third in the nation to legalize same-sex marriages, that creates kind of a problem because other states don't want to recognize same-sex marriages, and so if people come to Iowa to get married and then they decide to move somewhere else, are they considered legally married? That is a valid and very good question. And so a lot of states around us have dealt with that by creating their own state legislation, which is a Defense of Marriage Act, or a DOMA. And that basically says that the states don't have to follow the full faith and credit clause. Well, this creates a problem, and in fact, I'm still waiting for a Supreme Court case to come up that challenges that decision, because if they can do that for marriage licenses, who's to say they can't do it for birth certificates or for driver's licenses or titles to property? I mean, once you start that ball rolling down the hill, it kind of gets its own momentum and can cause some problems. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out in the future. There are some exceptions to the full faith and credit clause. It only applies to civil laws. It does not apply to criminal laws. Things with marriages and divorces, certain divorces, you have to fulfill residency requirements. So like Nevada with Las Vegas, they have quickie divorces, but many other states won't recognize them because you have to establish a residency before you can get it. And so they want that residency to be bona fide, and bona fide is just a Latin term for good faith, or that it's legal, it's valid. And so they have to establish that there was residency that was bona fide before the divorce goes through. Another way that states work together is through extradition, and extradition is the legal process in which a fugitive from law in one state is returned to the state where the crime happened. Most of these are approved, but sometimes they're contested if it's a custody battle with divorce, or maybe there's strong racial or political overtones that could influence the case. And finally, we have immunities and privileges. Immunities means that there can be no distinction drawn between people of different states. So you're free to travel, you're free to take up residency in any state, you can use the court system, you can get married, you can make contracts, you can buy and sell property, all of those things would be included. And then we have privileges, and privileges says that you can make a distinction between people, that if you have non-residents of your state that are using your state resources, then you can make that distinction. So things like paying a higher hunting or fishing licensing fee, because people are coming in and using your state's resources, you can charge them higher. Another way that it would probably affect you guys the most is that if they charge higher tuition at colleges and universities if you are a non-resident. If you're not from Iowa, they're going to charge you higher. If you go out of state, they're going to charge you higher because you're using the state's resources, and that can include education. So that, in a nutshell, is how federalism and the states and the national government work together.